Welcome back to Within Tolerance, a podcast for machinists by a machinist. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson from Protean Machining. And this week I'm joined by Jason Huey of 47s and Prometheus Lights. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me. It's
Of
pretty
course.
fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I know Brad, every time I talk to him, he was like, man, you got to get Jason on. I love his lights. And we talk all the time. So I'm really glad you could be on.
Well, thank you, Brad. Appreciate that.
So what does your company do, or what do your companies do? And where can people find you online so they can pull you up while we're talking about you?
I have no idea. Is that a good answer? It's complicated. So basically, I started Prometheus Lights, which sounds like a flashlight company, but now we do more stuff. In 2018, we acquired the 47s brand. So mainly we make flashlights and other EDC stuff that we can make on the equipment that we have and that I am into, basically. And you can find us at darksucks.com. And we also have Instagram and Facebook accounts for both brands, which is fantastic to have to run all of that. So we're, Prometheus Lights and 47s.
Awesome. Well, that's really cool. I know I've definitely been following along on your journey for a while. I saw you pop up on Kickstarter a bunch at the beginning, and I've just been watching all the lights, and it's definitely cool to see how you've grown the company.
Yeah, it's crazy. This is our 10-year anniversary, and I guess I've been so busy. I did not put together any 10-year anniversary special, so maybe this is it.
There you go. Well, congrats. That's a big year. And I think, what is it? They say that most businesses fail the first 5, and then the next big milestone is 10. And so if you make it past there, you're doing pretty well for yourself. So that's great.
Yeah, that is what they say. I try not to be superstitious about that.
No, definitely not. So real quick, I guess let's go, before we jump into your backstory, what's the rundown of your lineup right now? What products are you currently making? What are you famous for, I guess, all that stuff?
So we make a lot of stuff, which from time to time I sort of look at and I ask myself the question, do we make too much stuff? And some days the answer is yes. And some days the answer is, well, I think it's all good stuff. And we've put a lot of time and effort into it, so we should keep making it. So I started out with flashlight, and my first flashlight was the Alpha. And I don't know, I started making flashlights because, well, all right, the whole story is because we have some time, right? I was in grad school a bunch of years ago, and I was working on a project for a dive light that basically can't leak, which is pretty good for a dive light. That's like the one thing you want not to happen.
Yeah.
Is for that light to leak when you're underwater in the dark.
I'd say that's pretty integral to the whole idea.
Yeah. And so there are a lot of traditional ways to do that with O-rings and that sort of thing. But I came up with something else that I still think no one has done, potentially, because it's just a huge pain in the butt. But, for me, it was an experiment. It's a pretty big safety issue, when you're diving. But I realized I didn't know what I was doing. So I started basically just buying components. And, at this point, I had some manual shop equipment, like a mill and a lathe. And so I just started putting together single cell flashlights so I could figure out, sort of where the state of technology was and test out different LEDs and different ways to drive them and different kinds of batteries and that sort of thing. And that essentially turned into the Alpha flashlight. I was pretty active on Candle Power forums at the time, which is still around as far as I know. I'm less active. And I just started showing my work, and I don't know, it didn't take me very long to decide that I actually might want to try to make flashlights. My background is in product design, and I always had all kinds of weird esoteric side projects going. When you're at a party and you start talking about it and people glaze over, it's like just too bizarre and too technical. I'm like, okay. But when I started making flashlights and carrying them around, and this is back in like 2008, 9. Well, maybe 2008 and 9.
Because you were kind of like at the very beginning of the true EDC flashlight craze that it's become.
The market was much smaller then. Yeah. So, there were a few established guys, like literally a handful, some people that aren't around anymore, but like McGizmo and Max Customs for the two that come to mind. I apologize if I'm forgetting something totally obvious, but it was not a booming market at the time. And so coincidentally, I believe the first 4.7's Quark also came out in 2009. And as far as I know, that was really the first high output production LED flashlight. And it was like, I don't even know. It was sort of before my time, but like 250 lumens. And it was very impressive. And that's really the product that put 4.7's on the map. We still make that light today, but it's been upgraded quite a lot. Totally forgot what the question was. What is
Oh, it was just going back into your lineup. But actually, this might be a good segue first. You kind of touched on grad school. So what is your background? How did you, I guess, what were you in school for? You said product design. And then how did you kind of start in manufacturing? You said you already had some manual machines. So clearly you had some interest in it.
Yeah.
What's your whole background in this?
Well, when I was a young boy, no, not really. My background is completely all over the place. And honestly, one of the reasons I started my own business is because I was basically unemployable. And so all right, we can go all the way back. I'll be brief. So when I was in high school, it was really kind of the birth of mountain biking, and all these cool companies, aftermarket companies, started coming on the scene with CNC machine parts. And I don't know why, but I really gravitated towards that. I just thought it was really interesting. I mean, it was crazy. You could just take a solid piece of metal and apply other metal to it and come out with something just beautiful and intricate and functional. So when I was in high school, I was designing my own mountain biking parts, like on graph paper with a pencil and a ruler.
That's
anyone
awesome.
remembers those things. So I designed cranks and brake calipers and brake levers and stuff. And so one summer, when I was at home, I looked up a machine shop in the Yellow Pages, and I drove down there, and I showed the guy my drawing. He was like, "Well, that is incomplete, but we could work with that. It was like $800 and 1997 money." And I was like, well, I'm in high school. I don't have that kind of money. So that drawing is, still probably in a notebook in storage somewhere. But I was just always fascinated by it. And then it kind of took me a long time to get back around to manufacturing. So I was an architecture undergraduate major, which is basically a glorified art history major. So nothing to do with manufacturing at all. And then I got interested in product design and basically started freelancing and teaching myself product design. I think just my personality was kind of aligned with what is now sort of design strategy and design thinking, which briefly is a holistic approach. Because I think the way jobs are set up, people tend to, in some ways, if they're lucky, they can just figure out what they're interested in and follow that. But there's a lot of fairly narrow specialization. I was always interested in being broad. And design strategy and design thinking, try to combine everything from, visual design to product design to user interface, human factors. Is this a good product for an actual human being kind of stuff? So I freelanced for a bunch of years. I did all kinds of weird work. I used to design stuff for a fly fishing company. And then I ended up working with this mom and pop kind of startup that was designing basically a machine tool called the Laser Center Edge Finder, which they're still producing out of Fresno, California. Yeah. And so, it's still a great tool. At the time, it was pretty revolutionary. And it is literally what it sounds like. It is a laser that you use for a center or edge finder.
I think I've seen the videos on that. It rings a bell.
Yeah. It's basically a direct method for finding the edge of something. So instead of using an edge finder or wiggler where you find one point and then have to readjust it, was literally just a laser spot. So the thing that I designed for that is actually a polarizer that can control the intensity of the beam. And that effectively controls the size of the beam as well, because you have a lot of energy from that laser going into one spot. It's very hard to look at. You're machining metals, which are often very reflective. So you couldn't really optimize it for one thing or another. It's like if you want to pick up punch mark on anodized aluminum, that's very different than raw material. So basically the polarizer, just by twisting it, allows you to vary the intensity and therefore the perceived spot. And that tool, with a laser, just using your eyeballs to look at where it is, it was accurate and repeatable to within plus or minus 3 thou. Even if it's 5 or 10, part of it depends on the skill of the operator. that's like good enough for 90% of machining. Oh, well, let's say 80%, go with the 80-20 rule. And so I'd been doing freelance design for, I don't know, 8 years or something like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is machining. I'm going to learn more about it. So my weird interim step. Well, I'd been designing so much. I tell people that I got tired of having carpal tunnel and like wanted to get out of my chair. So I started working with this guy who was himself a machinist, and he was a professor at Fresno State's industrial technology program. So basically I spent a week with him in his like machine shop at home. He sort of showed me the fundamentals. And I went back home and bought a Shop Task. Are you familiar with this machine at all? It's the yellow 3-in-1 combo machine. So I got super into that. I think I spent more time learning about and repairing and making that machine work properly than I spent making parts. But that, frankly, was also a fantastic education. So it's funny, I was actually just looking at this yesterday. So I have a website called the-alchemist.com, and it is basically a catalog of my adventures with this machine over a period of years, up to the point where I basically finally started Prometheus and then stopped working on that site. So if you want to take a weird trip down my memory lane, you can go check that out.
Cool. That's cool that you have that to kind of look back on as well.
Yeah, it's like where it all started. And I mean, a lot of that is still really aligned with, what I'm trying to do today. Yeah, so I bought that machine. I was literally, I was in Boston at the time, like in an apartment. So I found this shack down the street. It was a set of like, 5 garages, like single car garages, dirt floors. It was amazing, like the bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling kind of thing. And so I rented that space, and like that was my first shop, which is pretty crazy to think about now. So I started teaching myself machining, and I was like, oh, I love this. I started taking welding classes at Mass Art, which is an art school. And then basically I decided I wanted to get more into making things. And one thing I'd always recognized as a weakness as a designer is I did not have direct experience with making things. I tried to be mindful of it because I was aware of it and this whole conflict between engineers and machinists. But I was like, okay, I want to be more hands-on. I want to try to put these two things together. So I actually ended up moving to Fresno to go to this master's in industrial technology program at Fresno State that this guy was a professor at. So while I was doing that, I also decided to go to school for machining and welding full-time in addition to this program. So I was going to Reedley Community College, which they have actually a really exceptional, in my opinion, manufacturing program there. And that's sort of where I'm like one of the weird people that went to school for it. I didn't like get a certificate or anything. I just took classes.
Went to community college too for it. I'm the same way. Like I still love the community college I went to, and I think they have an amazing program. So I totally empathize there.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people ask me like, oh, how should I get into machining? And I mean, I look at people like Grimsmo, and they're basically self-taught, and, look at where he is today. So that is a completely valid path. Thank you, internet. It's not really possible without that. But yeah, I always tell people to go to your local community college and see if they have a manufacturing program. I think with all pursuits, I'm sort of like an old person now where I'm like, you should learn the fundamentals. And I mean, I've found it really valuable. And I think one of the big things about having some baseline knowledge that you learn from an expert, like one-to-one, is you're going to save a lot of time and money in the short term, where you're like making mistakes, doing things that anyone with that basic knowledge would know you're not supposed to do.
Right. And knowing a drill check, that kind of stuff. You're going to skip right over that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've all done it in a pinch. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great place for anybody to start. And wow, this is a lot of rambling, but we'll get there. So I went to that program for about a year, and I ended up getting a summer internship down in LA at a fabrication shop that specialized in custom hot rods and motorcycles / movie props.
Wow.
And this is a company called EP Industries out of El Segundo, California. The owner has since unfortunately passed away, but he was just an amazing guy. I can't remember if he had only graduated high school or didn't even graduate high school. By far one of the smartest people I've ever met. So he was essentially completely self-taught as well. And his dad was a hot rod builder. So that's how he learned fabrication. And so I literally like, I don't know, the only shop I'd ever been in was at school. And I'd just been doing that, for a year. So I was like, I, kind of know what I'm doing. I sent him an email. And at the time in the fabrication world, he was pretty well known. He's like on the cover of like the Plasma Cam brochure and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, I'm going to go work for that guy. I sent him an email. He was like, come on down. And so I showed up. I was like, I don't know what to wear for a job interview at a shop. So I like had my portfolio and everything. I put it on his desk. He spent about 30 seconds flipping through it. And he was like, well, when can you start? And I was like, you don't like have questions or you don't want to look at the portfolio some more? And he was basically like, talk is cheap. Like, get out on the floor. We'll see how it plays out. So I like drove back to Fresno and I came back two weeks later to start working there. And the other shop guys called me 21. And I was like, what is up with that? And this went on for like a week or two. And I'm like the new guy and like sort of embarrassed. And I'm like, am I supposed to know what's going on? I don't know. And so I finally asked somebody, I was like, why do you guys call me that? And they're like, oh, you're the 21st employee this year. Whoa. And I mean, there were like 6 or 7 guys on the floor. And I was like, oh, okay. And I finally put 2 and 2 together. And his interview style was like, work out till you wash out, which I don't know. I thought was actually kind of cool. I mean, there's nothing more than that, right? Like put your money where your mouth is. And so while I was there for like 2 years. And I don't know, probably in that time, 5 or 6 people came through and, one dude lasted 2 hours and, somebody else was there for like 3 or 4 months and he was like trying to get him there and the guy just wouldn't get there. And I mean, he was pretty hardcore about just coming out and being like, all right, pack up your toolbox and don't come back.
Wow.
Which I don't know my understanding and talking to a lot of other people there is there was a lot of friction between him and the employees. I never had any. And I think in retrospect, with the experience that I have now, his big thing was like, do as well as you can. If you screw it up, fix it. Take responsibility for it. And I don't know, my only work mode has always been like as much as possible. And with Prometheus, I'm not, 4/7 as well, just running a business. I'm not doing it to be okay at it. My aspiration is to be as good as humanly possible at it, which is, unachievable. But I also, at least for me, I think it makes sense to set a goal that is unattainable so I can keep working towards it. Because as soon as you get comfortable, I think that's, when you start to get left behind. And I mean, now, after running a business for 10 years, I think one of the biggest challenges we have, or I guess that I have, is staying out in front because there are a lot of operational demands. We don't have very many people. And there's just so much that needs to be done. I don't have enough time to spend looking forward and also working on new stuff. So that's something I'm constantly trying to balance. But man, like there's so many people in EDC right now, like it's pretty tough. I don't know. It's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, it seems like a tough sector to be in general. Like, there's that old saying of like, nothing's new. Everything has already been done and you're just redoing something. I feel like it's only becoming more and more true in the EDC community, it seems like. So I imagine it's hard to innovate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like any industry. I think there are cycles. I mean, are you familiar with Blue Ocean Strategy? So it's a book that I read many, many years ago, but I guess for the listeners, essentially a blue ocean is a market that doesn't have a lot of competition. And a red ocean is one that does have a lot of competition. And presumably for innovators, blue ocean represents more opportunity. Sometimes there is the challenge of creating the market if it doesn't exist. But when I look at industries, and again, being like super into mountain biking, I've sort of seen this pattern play out a lot. And it seems pretty universal when a new market is created. And I mean, I don't know, EDC has sort of been around for a long time and it came out of law enforcement, but is kind of a hip pop culture thing. It's like pretty new. So there's a lot of potential in a market that is just emerging because there aren't a lot of people in it. It's easy to differentiate. Over time, if that market is successful, everyone starts jumping into it. Whether it's like my other big examples with outdoor clothing, it just gets really, really saturated. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of, derivative products. There's a lot of like copying. And at some point, that market gets so saturated, it starts to consolidate because not everyone's going to be successful. And that's really the reddest ocean, right? When everyone's trying to dive into it. So some companies are going to fall away. And eventually over time, you're going to be left with, sort of the big industry players that have survived.
Right. Well, I think we all saw that with fidget spinners. It was like a super quick condensing of that entire cycle.
That's a great point. Yeah, that whole thing was crazy. I've never seen something. I mean, there are probably lots of examples, but something that I've been close to like that has come and gone so quickly and got so big. I mean, you could buy them at 7-Eleven. It was just unreal. And now it's basically gone and they're still kind of, I mean, I don't know. I don't really pay a lot of attention, but I assume, some of the original guys are still around and maybe some of the newer ones are still around, but now it's only a handful. So that's a consolidated market. I mean, it's funny. I'm not sure how this necessarily, or if it applies to makers, but for like normal traditional companies, those big companies kind of get fat and lazy and they're just doing their thing and, everyone's comfortable. And then some upstart comes along and shakes up the market again. So like in outdoor clothing, that was Arc'teryx.
Right.
Because like, it's the same. I mean, a flashlight is a tube with some LEDs and a battery and a switch. Like what can you do with that? And that's something, I even struggle to figure out sometimes. It's like, what could you do with a jacket and pants that haven't been done before? And they did it. And now, I mean, so many of the features and stuff that Arc'teryx came up with, you see across lots of different manufacturers now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you see it, I mean, popping up even in like Amazon Basics versions of that stuff. Like, it's in everything. Yeah, I know. Yeah. The ultimate copier. So back to your backstory, you were doing this internship, you were in grad school. You said that Prometheus came out of the end of grad school.
Oh yeah. Are we all the way back to here again? Okay. Yeah. So I worked at this fabrication shop for a couple of years. And then I actually moved up to San Francisco to go to business school. So I was in business school for 2 years. And basically while I was doing that, I decided to rent a shop space and I had like no equipment at the time, but I was like, all right, so on the side while I'm in school, I'm going to try to set up a little fabrication shop and drum up work. So, I mean, over time, I bought my first Bridgeport, which is a 1973 Bridgeport. And then a few months later, I bought a Hardinge HLVH manual lathe, which is the best tool I have ever used. And I think that one's in 1977. I ended up getting a free bandsaw and like rebuilding it. Actually, one of the things I really love is just rebuilding old tools. Sometimes I'm like, should I just start one of those YouTube channels, like rebuilds tools? It's like a retirement project. And I ended up, getting a couple jobs and I was like, okay, well now I need a welder because I stuck my foot in this one. So I sort of built up a little shop doing that and then started working on this dive light that I had been working on in grad school. Oh yeah, by the way, I dropped out of grad school, the industrial technology program, in favor of staying at that shop for a couple of years. And I was like, you know what, I think already learned more than I'm going to get out of finishing that. So I moved up to San Francisco to go to business school and I started making the flashlights. And then I tried to simplify that because I was in over my head and started making a flashlight that again, essentially became the Alpha. Wow, that took so long to get back here.
No, that's what I love about this show. We get to hear the whole gamut of everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny too, because that's what I've actually enjoyed about listening to some of your other guests is there's a lot of backstory that never gets talked about anymore or was like talked about so long ago that nobody knows it. So I made a bunch of prototypes. I started just putting it up on Candle Power forums. And once I finally was like, I could maybe sell these, because again, I was showing them to people. And, when you take a 500 lumen flashlight in somebody's backyard at night and turn it on, particularly back in 2009, Like people were just agog, right? That was even possible. And so, I mean, that in itself was kind of rewarding. I'm like, yeah, it's like a superpower in your pocket. That's cool. So I don't know. It's funny. Forums, are forums still relevant? Like, do you participate in any forums?
Not really anymore. I use them for information for like my cars and stuff, like old
Right.
information that I'm trying to relook up, but I don't think I've actively participated in one in a long time. I don't know about you.
Right. So, I mean, I don't know with like car forums. I mean, again, most forums, I'm just a browser lurker. I don't really participate. But there's always this weird thing where somebody just drops in out of nowhere and tries to start selling things. And everyone that's been there is like, what is this all about? So when I realized I might want to try to sell some flashlights, because again, other guys were doing it, I realized I needed to be strategic. And so my approach to the forum was very intentional. And I'd just been reading Candle Power forums for like years. Like that's sort of where I landed when I got into the whole dive light thing. But so as I was making things, I was like, all right, I'm going to show all my work, because partly those were the threads that I liked reading. And also, you learn a lot from that, from watching how other people do things. So that was also sort of one of my missions. And I think it sort of still is, but my relationship with that is a little bit different in terms of being completely open and sharing everything so other people can learn from it. The position I'm in now is sometimes the wrong people learn from it. That comes back to bite you. But I mean, I think that's also the power of the internet. And it's really cool, especially being a maker in this day and age, because that's really what makes it possible. But so I tried to build this relationship with the forum before I started actually trying to sell anything. And eventually somebody's like, oh, that's sick. Can I buy one? I'm like, yeah. So that was in 2009. The Alpha we make today is mechanically as the original flashlight. And that was one of my goals in designing it, is for it to be future proof. And so I knew there were a number of things that I was not happy with, but I couldn't fix at the time. But I sort of built in the ability to upgrade and change those things without making it all obsolete. I mean, it was really an exercise for me in, creating the ultimate flashlight. Like, I spent a lot of time with that focus. And like, I think I kind of did it. I don't know. I mean, it's still around. Any upgrade that we have is backwards compatible with 99% of the lights, the Alpha flashlights that were ever made. And even now, we're looking at upgrading some of the LEDs and the boards they're mounted to. And it's not always easy, but I'm like, we have to make this compatible, because that is just part of my jam. I hate planned obsolescence. I hate unplanned obsolescence. And I really want to build heirloom quality products, because I also hate it when things fail me and then I have to buy another one, or where the person who designed it. And I mean, maybe often the problem is too with a lot of the products we buy, they're designed by a huge team of people, and maybe designed for other reasons than being good. So I don't know. It's just, if I'm going to spend my time on it, like everything we make, I think is kind of a reflection of like who I am and how I see the world. That gets harder and harder to maintain as things get bigger and more complicated. But
so full circle back. So your lineup is the Alpha now. You also have the Beta, the Lambda top.
The Beta is a keychain light, and that was the first quick release keychain light on the market. Now there are a number of them.
I love your actuation though, where you pull it and it turns on. That's
so
slick.
Yeah. That's really. And it's not even really anything I did. It's just something I found, but it's really the thing that makes it work better than everything else, because people use magnets and stuff like that. I love magnets for most EDC stuff. No, because it, depends on how it's implemented. But generally, I don't want to be sticking to everything, and I don't want my gear to get covered in dirt. And, we use magnets in some things, but you can do things well, you can do some things poorly, and sometimes you just have to make the least bad choice.
Right.
So Beta flashlights, which have been, one of our top products for a long time, and they just kind of work and they do what they're supposed to do. We still make spin tops, even though the whole fidget spinner thing absolutely killed us. When fidget spinners became popular, it was in 2 or 3 months, maybe? It went from 0 to 10 million. We were selling 300 tops a month.
Wow.
And over the span of 30 days, that went down to maybe 30 and never recovered.
That's interesting. I never would have thought that those two customer bases would overlap, because they seem like such a different thing. Like
right.
Fidget spinner, I'm not paying attention to. if I was going to buy a real nice top, like it would be kind of a meditation thing, you know?
So you make a valid point. I cannot support my position with any kind of data, but so does correlation imply causation? I don't know. Maybe it was just time, but I mean, it was like, literally within 30 days, we went from 300 to 30.
That's crazy.
That was like the same month that Fidget Spinners blew up. So I don't know. I'd actually be curious to hear from other top makers if they felt any impact or not, or maybe it was just some weird thing that applied to us. Like, I don't know. But that was the first top to have a ruby ball bearing. So I always try to, when I design a new product, to bring something different. It's often very hard to do that. Like you said, there's nothing new. I'm more of a hard worker than like terribly smart or creative. And so I will just slam my face into the thing enough times until I can shake out something that I feel good about. So like I think with that, the beta, it was the quick release and also high color rendering. As far as I know, there weren't really any production flashlights before the beta. They were high CRI.
Well, and that's like a big thing throughout all your lights. I mean, I know you're a big proponent of high CRI lights and kind of a big LED nerd when it comes to that.
Yeah, I think for me, that's part of being well-rounded. To me, lumens are like horsepower. It's often easier for people to relate to car stuff. And it's like, sure, some people want a dragster. For EDC, I don't know, that's a personal choice. For me, that's not what it's all about. I don't even really like Porsches, but my example is always like the Porsche 911. It's been around so long and it's been iterated so many times. And people are going to disagree with this. It's okay if you hate Porsches. Don't have to send me mean messages. But it's just been refined and refined and refined. And I think it's become a much more well-balanced car. And so, what is a car? Is it just about horsepower? Well, you need to accelerate. You need to stop. You need to corner. Again, not if you're a dragster, but what personally appeals to me is being well-rounded and well-balanced. So I think the color rendering, lumens are impressive. Color rendering, I think, is useful. So that's really one of my early attempts to differentiate from what everyone else is doing. And it still continues to be a little bit difficult because people are like, well, how many lumens does that have? And I'm like, my question is, how many do you actually need? Not how many you maybe want or think you want.
Yeah. Like I'd love 1,000 lumens in my pocket, but if it's not usable, what's the point?
Or 1,000 horsepower, right? It's like almost a direct correlation.
Yeah.
Like 80, 90 horsepower. It depends on what the vehicle it is, right? Like for a motorcycle, that's great. That's a tool for a job. 1,000 horsepower in a car, like that sounds awesome. I've never driven 1,000 horsepower car. I would like to try it out. But like 2, 3, 500, like that's plenty of horsepower for a daily driver. It's plenty of lumens for an EDC light. I'm also a huge fan of the 80-20 rule. I don't know if you are into that at all, but I think my interest in lights is things that you can actually use. So the stuff I design is good for 80% of use for EDC. There are some fringe cases where you need that tool to do something more specialized, and that's totally fine. That's the same with all tools. I really view flashlights as tools. You have to pick the right tool for the job. There are different tools for different jobs. Oh yeah, we were talking about betas and tops. So yeah, tops, pens also. That was one of our big Kickstarters early on. Now there are lots of pens out there. The pen we make is a 3-piece executive pen. I've always been into Montblancs. I own one. It's not a very expensive one, but I'm like, it's a Montblanc. And then I got it and I was like, this thing's made of plastic. It was like, I don't know what it was, $300, $400, $500. It's made of plastic. I was like, I can do better than that. But the beautiful thing about the Montblanc is the fine liner refill specifically. And that's what I was in love with. I realized I wasn't in love with the rest of it. So I, sort of wanted to make something in my image that would hold that refill. And that was also a weird decision, but I'm a little bit weird. So the other trend at the time was to make a pen that would fit every possible refill on Earth. And that just doesn't appeal to me as a human being. It seems like probably none of them work very well.
Right.
So I wanted to take my favorite refill and purpose build something around that was going to work well and look and be satisfying to use. But again, that's like, I try to have a perspective or a point with everything we do. So flashlights, pens, tops, those are really our biggest ones. The other one is our Kappa keychain, which honestly, I think is actually our best product in terms of overall how many different factors it satisfies in terms of, being good and working well. And that uses the same mechanism as the Beta flashlight. So it's just a push together, pull apart. It uses a canted coil spring we have made by this company. That's all they make are canted coil springs. Yeah. Oh, and so I was saying earlier, I found that mechanism by accident at a trade show. Yeah. So, and I mean, that's one of the reasons I like to go to trade shows, and I haven't been to one in a couple of years now, or like tool trade shows, is you just find cool stuff. And it's often stuff I can't use, but like I put that in my book for later. And so when I designed the very first Beta that was on Kickstarter, it had one of those plunger style quick releases, like every cheap keychain you've ever seen.
Little ball detent ones.
Yes. It's like, they're just horrible. I mean, after making thousands of lights with that mechanism in it and going through different suppliers, it's just too complicated. They're not well made and they fall apart. Like that is the antithesis of what I am interested in. I want like simple, durable, repairable. So I talked to this company about the springs, and they're like, yes, our minimum is, 10,000 units. And they were also really, really expensive. I was like, all right, what's my next worst solution? And that was the plunger. But I always knew from the beginning that I wanted to use the coil spring. There's just no way that I could afford to do that at those kind of volumes. So eventually we grew into it. And I mean, that's the first thing I changed when I could. But I think when you're designing any product, if you want it to last, you sort of have to think down the road, right?
Right. Here's what I can do now. Here's what I want to do with it. Let's make both work, kind of thing.
Right. And so, I mean, it's funny because a lot of the times, particularly flashlights, people are like, oh, well, why didn't you do this? And it's like, it's not because I didn't think of it. It just for the dozens of reasons, it's potentially not possible. It doesn't work right now, which is also one of the hardest things about making stuff that I'm not sure people think about very much. You can design something, then you have the practical limitations in physically manufacturing it. But there's a lot. I'm trying to come up with a list of what these things are, but just like part costs and supply chain and what kind of scale can you leverage. And if your answer is like 0, then it's really hard unless you can do it yourself. And I think what's super cool about, 2021 is there's so much stuff that you can do yourself. And so, I mean, for example, I'm buying a new 3D printer that I can use to make parts I want to change that I don't want to pay for an injection mold for. And buying the printer is cheaper than having a new mold made. And we're not making, 10, 50, 100,000 parts.
Right.
I can conceivably make what I need right now, just in time on the printer. And I don't totally know if that's going to work. It's a little bit of a gamble, but I'm like, this is one of the reasons we have technology.
What printer is it?
It's a Form 3.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a lot of experience with Form 2s.
Yeah.
It's a really cool ecosystem.
Yeah, I've never used one before. I mean, I'm actually buying another printer also, which we could talk about later. I'm super into 3D printing right now. It's the future, man.
I think especially for a designer, it's such a cool tool to have access to because you don't waste your time machining prototypes that end up in the trash.
Oh my gosh. It's like, it's unreal, so I'm happy to talk some more about 3D printing. I do want to waste everyone's time talking about 4.7s. Not that 4.7s is a waste of time, but
yeah. So actually,
I don't usually talk this much.
It's good. Okay, so Obsidian Tools from Instagram asked, please dive into the thought process behind the acquisition of 4.7s. Why not grow Prometheus to that size? Is it difficult to handle 2 businesses at once, especially with one having production offshore? And what are the synergies between the 2 brands?
Yes. Perfect segue. So 4.7 was started in 2009 by a guy named David Chow. I don't know if people still remember him or not, because it's been a couple years and that's a lot. That's a long time in today's world. He's basically a legend in the flashlight industry. And in my opinion, he and 4.7s are really responsible for the birth of the EDC flashlight. I mean, we talked about flashlights just being a tube. Like, there are only so many ways to decorate a flashlight. There are only so many ways that are easy to manufacture that fall under standard, milling and turning practices that you can do with a flashlight and still have it be affordable. But so, sometimes people are like, well, 4.7s looks like all other flashlights that are made. I think it's actually kind of the opposite. And I feel fairly free to say that because that wasn't work that I did. It would be like too self-serving to be like, no, everyone's like us. But I really think like 4.7s, particularly that knurled aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
Knurling is one of the most obvious things you could put on a flashlight, but it hadn't really been done in that same way. And that was one of the core design principles with the early 4.7 stuff, was just to have a lot of knurling on it. And so David was also involved. Oh boy, I hope I get this right. I think with Phoenix in the early days, and he was also involved with Olight right up until the end.
Oh, really? Okay.
I guess I can talk about this. We might have to ask him and maybe edit this out. But so he was one of three owners of Olight, even up until the end. So there were a lot of synergies there, and people speculated a lot about that. And it's like, yes, there was a relationship there. That's also why we share some products and features with them, is because they were, the acquisition. So I met David Chow at SHOT Show in 2012. I actually crashed the 4.7s party. There was like a dinner that was like invite only, and somebody was like, hey, do you want to go? I was like, yeah, I wasn't invited. They're like, it'll be fine, nobody will know the difference. So I went to this thing and I met David, and we just we kept in touch. Like, we'd exchange 2, 3, 4 emails a year over the years. And basically out of the blue, he called me up and he was like, hey, I would like to get out of the business. Are you interested? And I was like, yes, no. Yes, no. And we had a lot of conversations over, I don't know, maybe 6 or 9 months or something. I flew out to Atlanta and spent like a week with he and his family. And we just like talked about how it was going to work and, what the future of 4.7s was going to be. So, 4.7s is a brand that I always looked up to as one of the leaders in the industry. They had always pushed really hard, particularly on the technology front. And that's something they became known for. All of the other flashlight companies, mostly Chinese, they are huge now. Much, much bigger than 4.7s was even at its peak. 10, 20 times bigger than we are now. We don't have the resources to compete against a staff of, like 20 mechanical engineers and 20 electrical engineers. So right now, one of my approaches to the product line is to sort of get back to product design fundamentals and figure out, is this a useful tool for human beings? Like, I'm not interested in spec sheets and like maxing out performance in unusable ways. I'm like, can you really use this flashlight? Which is not sexy, but man, like anyone who knows tools knows there's a difference between good tools and bad tools.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And like, which, given the choice, which one are you going to pick?
Well, and like you focus a lot on even things that you don't really think about. Like, I can't remember if it was your podcast or somewhere else, but you were talking how much time you spend on pocket clips alone and making sure that they're like usable and don't suck. Cause there are a lot of pocket clips out there that really suck.
Well, okay. I am not super current on all the pocket clips that are out there, but I think pocket clips are an afterthought. And for me, a pocket clip is one of the most fundamental pieces of a flashlight, because when it is in your pocket, again, 80% of the time or more, that's most of its function, which is hilarious for a flashlight. But most of a flashlight's function is to sit in your pocket, right? So, that clip needs to hold well. It needs to be easy to engage. It needs to not break all the time. It needs to not get snagged on other things. I think one thing that I think most people don't understand about a properly designed pocket clip is it is also maybe 80% of the grip that you have on a flashlight. So we look at the ergonomics of all our clips in terms of the size of the clip and the size of the light. and how it falls in your hand, and people have vastly different size hands. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But the intent is for that to add to the whole and not detract from it. And sometimes there are just limitations, like there are with everything, where you can't make it as ideal as you want. But even, I mean, I spend as much time as I can when I have to compromise, trying to make that compromise as small as possible. Yeah. So
what about handling the two businesses together, especially with one not being produced in the US, and then synergies between the two, I guess?
Right. I don't recommend running two businesses at the same time.
To anyone.
I think most of my hair has fallen out in the last couple of years. It is very difficult. I think, I mean, I don't know. It's like running two businesses for all the reasons that you should only run like half a business. Nothing gets enough attention. I don't think manufacturing overseas, I mean, there's the obvious problem of it's easier to work with somebody when you're in the same room with them. Many of us have been telecommuting over the last year. Like, you can do it. It's just not optimal in terms of working with vendors. Like, it sort of doesn't matter if that vendor is on the East Coast or in China. Every vendor I've worked with probably over time has had problems, no matter how good they are. I mean, hold on. The question is precisely, offshore production. Is this, I mean, I feel like it's not as hot button as it was back in the day. I mean, I guess, I don't know if you have a different opinion of that, but it seemed like it was a huge deal for a while, and now everyone's kind of accepted it.
Well, and I think the fact that the brand had always been produced offshore, you didn't take a company that was producing in the US, buy it up, and then ship all the stuff overseas. I think that
right.
would have been a very inflammatory thing to do. Whereas you just bought a brand that already was producing overseas and brought it in-house, kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think that's a good point. There are two parts to that. There was the original offshoring that everyone was mad about because they're shipping, US jobs overseas. So there's that piece of it. The other piece that I hear about a lot is the whole quality thing. I don't think the country where your manufacturer is located defines what the quality is or not. This is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, particularly over the last 10 years, which is when and where all of these changes have taken place. I think when people think about bad quality coming out of China, it's because that's what the US and other countries are requesting.
Right.
They want it to be as cheap as possible. Like, what do you think you get for as cheap as possible? You get crappy.
Yeah.
So that's not China's fault. That's what the market has demanded of them. I think that went on for so long. You have people who've worked in factories and people who've owned factories during that entire time who are trained to pinch every fraction of a penny, who are trained to cut corners, because if they don't, their foreign buyers beat them up so hard over stuff that they can't continue to run the business. If you find a factory like that, it is very difficult to get them to change. I mean, it's like any person who's been, grew up essentially operating the business this way. It's hard to come in and ask them to do that differently. So, I mean, people are people, no matter what. There are some people who run companies that take pride in what they do. There are some people who run companies just to make as much money as possible, and they don't care about anything else. I mean, I don't know that that's answering the question directly, but I mean, I guess in terms of stuff I want to talk about, yes. So manufacturing in China is hard for that reason, but if you can develop the right partnerships with the right people, it is much easier.
What I've heard from a lot of people, like, I don't know if you follow Discommon on Instagram, but he's talked a lot in his stories about having Chinese vendors for prototyping and some production, and how if you find the right one, their quality is, best in the world, let alone best in China.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think the knife industry is a great example of this. And I'm not like super into knives or the knife industry, but my understanding is like the knives that are coming out of China are pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And I mean, China's also a much more expensive place to manufacture than it was 10 years ago. Like, I mean, our prices are constantly going up. I think maybe now it's easier to find good manufacturers in any country offshore. Well, it just depends on how long that country's been doing, been offshoring for, and what their relationship is, between the buying and selling country. I think in China, quality is increasing because, I don't know, probably largely because of big industry like Apple and stuff like that. But it's just not unheard of anymore to be like, I want you to make something that's high quality. They're like, okay, you can find those kinds of people.
So because of the different price point of 4.7s, did it feel like you were purchasing a competitor or just another brand in the larger space?
I mean, I think 4.7s has always been more consumer oriented. And 4.7s was never a big company. I think David Chow rolled like a big company. I mean, I was fairly shocked to find out how small they were because they look and act like a big company. And I mean, I think that was a fantastic marketing strategy that worked at the time. I mean, when I took it over, not including David, I think 4.7s had 3 employees.
Wow.
We ended up keeping one of them just because that job could be done remotely, and we're out here now. So operationally, again, we're competing with companies that potentially, like Chinese flashlight companies, have like hundreds of people, some of them. So I felt like there actually was a good synergy there because 4.7s was more of a consumer brand. Prometheus was more of a, I don't know, I guess a premium EDC brand. So my expectation was that actually buying 4.7s would allow me to leverage a lot of 4.7's existing manufacturing resources in order to make the 4.7's product better, but also potentially, coming up with new stuff that hasn't really been done before. And I think the biggest thing, and I guess this goes back to whole, David and I like hung out for a week talking about all of this. I think philosophically, we're very well aligned. And that is ultimately what made this possible. And that, 4.7's was his baby. He didn't want to hand it off to someone who he thought was going to ruin it. And, I've also been, despite some people's upset, tried to be, very mindful about both the integrity of the brand and the product line. It's just not easy to do. So, people are like, oh my God, I can't believe this like little boutique company bought out a bigger company. They had more sales than we did at the time, but they were not a bigger company. So I don't know. I felt like that was a pretty natural fit, both in terms of philosophy and scale. There have been some significant hurdles and challenges since then that I had not anticipated.
Oh, really?
One of which is the pandemic. But so the manufacturer, I don't know, whatever. I'm transparent. So Olight used to manufacture all of 4.7's flashlights.
Oh, really?
I don't know if anybody cares about that being a secret at this point or not. I was never totally clear why it was a secret. So, Olight is big now. I would say generally their flashlights are pretty solid. This is totally an aside. I feel like, and I don't know what your experience is, there are always problems in manufacturing. Like, it doesn't matter whether we're doing it in-house or buying product from someone else. The one thing you can count on is the thing that you least expected to be a problem is now a problem. And the thing that you most expected to be a problem is easily solved.
It always happens. Whether it's the part level, you're like, oh, the op I was worried about went through without a hitch, and then I scrapped everything, and the op that I thought would be a cakewalk, to big machine things where you're like, oh, the part that I thought was reliable for 10,000 hours is 1,000 hours in and broke. So and it's crazy how that works. And so we make stuff in-house. We also have other people make stuff for us. So I feel like I have a pretty well-rounded view of, both of those scenarios. And I feel like there's some expectation. It's like, well, if you control everything, that makes it easy. Some things are easier. One of the main things is like the amount of time it takes between finding and solving a problem. But manufacturing is hard, man. There are certainly some people that make it look easy. And if you have anything that goes smoothly, it's just because you have poured out everything you have to make it that way. Totally. Yeah.
So, the biggest problem that we ran into is that in 2019, Olight gave us 6 months notice.
Oh, geez.
And they were like, we're not doing anything for you anymore. And I was like, well, okay, that's
Oof. That's rough.
If anyone wants to know why we haven't been doing as much new stuff as you expected us to do. That's one of the big reasons. But like, that's life, that's manufacturing, that's running a business. And you just have to deal with that and move on.
So do you have any lessons learned about finding a new supplier?
I mean, I worked with manufacturing in China before I started doing this through, other companies and other projects. So I had some familiarity with it. I mean, I think particularly with 4.7s, one of the big reasons that I was interested in taking over the brand is to have access essentially to Olight's resources.
Right.
That completely vanished. So then I essentially had to start over. So I think there's maybe an eggs in one basket lesson to be learned there, even though I thought I was buying into a stable and long-term relationship. So currently we are a little bit more diversified and are a little bit more selective about our vendors and what their capabilities are. But I don't know. I was just like, I'm going to, put on the Iron Man suit with 4.7s and just go nuts on the flashlight industry. And it didn't work that way because the suit was broken. But I mean, we just launched a new product, the MXS standby light that has an inductive charging base. That took like a year and a half to develop. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but bringing new lights to market really takes a long time. And I keep trying to be like, we need to do this faster, but that's how long it takes.
Right.
I think that the response has been amazing. I don't know, sometimes when like things aren't going your way or not every product does as well as you want, you like start to question if you know anything or not. But that light has been really popular for us. The feedback in particular has been really, really good. It's a little bit of a more modern light. It is also has a point and is dedicated to a more specific task, and that is hanging out and, being ready when you need it. So it is not an EDC light. It's more of just an everyday light.
Yeah. And you want to talk about 1,000 horsepower, 1,700 lumens is no joke.
Yeah, it's plenty. I mean, what are you going to do with all that horsepower?
Well, for a standby light though, I mean, if all the lights go off, you want something to light your entire house or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, so one of the ways I think about flashlight power is in terms of distance and volume. And I'm sort of an engineering nerd. So like, you talk about brightness. What does that mean, man? Like, give me some numbers. So distance and volume. What I mean is if you're up close, you don't need a lot of light. If you're far away, you do. If you're in an enclosed environment, you don't need a lot of light. If you're in an open environment, you do. So that's where you have to balance how many lumens your light has. And if your light has so many lumens, what are you doing with that light? Are you spreading it out broadly, which is lower intensity? Or are you focusing it down? And that also plays into the distance thing as well. So a light with a tight hotspot isn't super useful up close.
Right.
It's useful at long range. A light that produces a lot of broad lumens isn't that useful at long range unless you have a lot of them. And that can also make up for it. Yeah, I mean, everyone's into power. Like, I get it. I like horsepower as much as the next person. So, yeah, I mean, part of the deal with the MXS is like, I want to make a brighter light. Now, there are people these days making much brighter lights. But again, like if you want a toy, that's great. If you want a tool that's going to get the job done, partly what we're balancing is like heat and battery life and LED longevity. And so, I mean, as with any kind of engineering, you got to make sacrifices to get other things.
Definitely. I think that's a great segue too to Ben at Fort Manufacturing's question from Patreon. What is the process for designing a light circuit? What makes different designs better than others? Because you have your own driver as well, the Icarus, right?
So first up, I am not an electrical engineer. So I do not design drivers at the circuit and component level. I tend to specify what they're supposed to do, and somebody smarter and more talented than me figures that out. That's actually a really, really hard question to answer. And there are endless arguments about all aspects of this on the internet.
So I guess what are the considerations you specifically put into your drivers?
Right. Well, I mean, everything I am focused on at the top of all that is reliability. Because again, like I'm a person who uses things. I'm not just a company owner that designs and sells things. I hate it when things are not reliable. When I pay money for something, the one thing I want it to do is do the job that it's supposed to do. So like at the component level, that means actually using quality components, not the cheapest ones. So we tend to use brand name components whenever they are available. which is a new thing. So, no like gray market off the shelf kind of stuff. That also is having good relationships with those suppliers. Some things that are super critical, we purchase and send to China.
Oh, wow.
So we can be absolutely certain that we're, getting what we paid for. Because even a factory in China is buying all their SMD components from a supplier. That's just another layer. Like, how good is that relationship? How reliable is it? Sometimes you don't find out until later that their supplier was short on something. So in order to fulfill the order, they went to some other supplier that also didn't have that thing, but they had some reject roll and they just sold you. I mean, it gets very complicated quickly. I think simplicity is one of the most important things. Like, the more complicated you make something, the more likely it is that it's going to break. So we try to make it as simple as possible. Also, so that we can use larger components when we can. Oftentimes we are just packing a ridiculous number of components into a very small space, which is one of the biggest limitations with small flashlights. And the smaller the components get, the less reliably they're placed and all that sort of thing. In terms of overall flashlight driver design, you have to know what LED you're going to be driving, what battery you're using, and ultimately what you want that light to do. There are 3 basic LED driver topologies, and I will gloss over this so no one falls asleep. There is a buck driver, which steps down a voltage. So say your battery is 8 volts and your LED is 3 volts. You need to step that voltage down before you feed it to the LED. There is a boost driver, which steps up the voltage. So like with a AA, if it's 1.5 volts, your LED still wants 3. So you've got to double that voltage before it gets there. And then there are buck boost drivers that are capable of doing both of these things. Like we said, nothing is for free, and to get something, you have to give up something. So there's no answer to what the best topology is, but the more things you're trying to do, usually the less good it is. A lot of people use buck boost drivers and it gets the job done, but there's sort of some physics and engineering limitations that come along with that. So we try to pick one when possible. That's one of the big reasons with the Quark, we actually split that product line into 2. And it already was before that, sort of, but people still get mad at us anyway. Because one of the things about the Quark is it's like, it can use any battery, well, except for this case. So we just, if that was split 80-20, we split it down the middle. So there's still 2. They're just proportioned differently. So basically, one is designed to use lithium batteries and the other one is designed to use non-lithium. And again, there are a bunch of reasons for that. One of them is safety. The other one is like, it just doesn't work very well.
Because that used to be a really big, scary thing about custom flashlights was the handling lithium cells and
exploding thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the last lithium explosion big thing that I've seen was the Samsung phones, but like I haven't seen big flashlight
and the
issues.
Boeing Airbus.
Yes.
Remember that?
So
yeah.
And consumer electronics though. Yeah.
But so my point there is that Boeing and Samsung have all of the resources in the world to do that job right. They screwed something up.
Yep.
Like, we're just a little company that makes flashlights, man. So we try to like reduce the number of opportunities to screw up. I mean, I think that's my main approach to reliability and quality control. So for example, in terms of safety, I think it's still probably popular, but in the past, the most popular battery combination was to use 2 CR123 lithium cells in series back to back.
Uh-huh.
That configuration, I would say, I'm going to make up a number here. I don't have any data. Accounts for 95% of flashlight explosions.
Really?
Like, it is a real thing that happens.
Why is that?
So lithium cells hold a lot of energy and they don't like to be out of balance. So running cells in parallel is okay. But when you run them in series, now they're talking to each other. And if there's a problem in one cell, say you accidentally mixed a charged and discharged one, or there's an internal short circuit in one of those batteries, which is the battery degrades. Like if you use an old battery with a new battery, even though they're fully charged, any imbalance in those cells means that energy is going to start doing weird things. One of those things is trying to find its own equilibrium. So one of those cells starts basically charging backwards, and that generates heat, and that eventually leads to catastrophic failure. We don't sell 2-cell lights anymore. It's just not worth it. And it's very rare for a flashlight to explode. It does happen. And like the flashlight's not supposed to be dangerous, man. It's just supposed to like help you out when it's dark.
Right.
And a lot of people were super mad about that. And so we replaced it with a single lithium battery that ships in the light. But people are like, I want that 2-cell thing. And I'm like, I don't do that. I planted my flag. And I mean, sometimes it's hard to like go against what everyone else wants, especially when they're customers. But like, I think if you're a company that doesn't have any principles, then I don't want to buy stuff from you.
Well, and as a consumer, I appreciate that kind of thought because I don't want to have to be a light expert to buy a light from you and know
Exactly.
the risks that I'm taking on.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have risks. Like you said, it's a light. I should just be able to see in the dark with it. And that's all I want to know about it, you know?
Right. Some things are obviously risky. Like that knife is sharp on that side. I'm like, okay, fine. Like you can tell that with looking, you can tell that by looking at it. But nobody expects a flashlight to blow up in their mouth while they're like trying to jumpstart their car or something.
Right. Exactly. So the other part of his question that I thought was interesting, we kind of already went over components and having a hard time sourcing them in COVID, but he asked, what's your favorite flashlight that you don't make?
I tried to think about this beforehand. None of them. I'm turning away from the screen as I say that. Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't pay a lot of attention to what other makers are doing. Every once in a while, I will buy something that interests me, but it's because it has a point. Like, I don't know. And I mean, I'm sure some people would say this about our stuff, that it doesn't, like, I don't see what the point is either.
So you buy like a 20% light when you buy somebody else's. You're not buying an 80% light.
That's a good question. I'm trying to think what the last light that I bought was. I mean, when I started out, I intentionally did not buy flashlights at all because I wanted that vision to be my own. I wanted to solve my own problems. I didn't want to accidentally, combine somebody else's approach with my own. And that was sort of an artificial thing, but it was intentional.
No, you and Brad are birds of a feather there. He said the same thing about the knife industry.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's, like do your own work. I don't know. What is the last light that I paid money for? Wow, I don't think it. Don't worry, we can edit this long, awkward pause out.
Well, while you think of it, let's move on to the second part, which was what's your favorite EDC item?
No.
Nothing?
So, I was going through the same process. I mostly carry my own stuff. Part of it is like, I am not a collector. And I guess partly to answer the flashlight question, I finally did buy a Sinner and I bought an Okluma. Like, I don't know. Well, the entire last year didn't exist. So it was like the year before that. Because I was like, okay, I'm at a point 10 years in where I'm curious to see what they're doing. I bought those out of curiosity, mainly. Mm-hmm. I used them. They're great. It was not what I was into. I think actually the thing that makes Alphas and Deltas great is the driver.
Okay.
And the interface and the customizability. So, I mean, I probably should have answered this question before. What is unique about those lights? It's the driver. It is effectively the same as the H17F driver. They're both designed by Dr. Jones. We actually sort of developed them at the same time. I mean, I guess like I helped him out with the development and I said, I want this specifically. So interface wise, they're the same thing. The H17 is a direct drive, or well, it's a FET light, but it just means on the highest setting, you're essentially getting unregulated power to the LED, and I don't do that. It is cool. It's the whole horsepower thing again. That is not, for me, that is not usable nor reliable. That is a toy. I'm not interested. So pens, right? Because I make pens. Mm-hmm. So the 2 pens I carry, other than my own pens, the audience isn't going to be able to see, but I've got a Grimsmo pen that I won at the last show I was at. I mean, I won the pleasure of paying for it. And I also have a couple of Will Hodges side click pens. Both of these, I think I was interested in the mechanism because, again, that has a point that's different. It's not another bolt action pen. Please, no more bolt action pens. I don't know who made the first one. Good for you. People are like, are you going to make a bolt action pen? I'm like, I can't bring myself to do it at this point. Maybe if I was like early on, I would have considered it unless I can find something about it.
Right. This is different. Yeah.
Right.
We're deep into a red ocean territory there.
Yeah.
So what about knives? Do you carry any knives?
I do. So on me right now, I have a Scout Leather Cub, the compact utility blade or something. It's a little, I don't know, I think Rexford started making these originally. So this is Scout Leather's design. We share shop space. Again, I think like this is derivative in some ways. I think the execution and the mechanical design is very interesting and it's very well done. I have a ceramic box cutter blade in it. It's hard not to be derivative in this industry. Like, I don't care if you are inspired by like something I did, just like put your own spin on it.
Right.
And if I'm going to do something that's remotely similar to someone else, I'm either going to ask them permission or I'm going to make sure it's got my own spin enough that I feel comfortable with that. I would say the Cub, which you can't buy anymore because Joe's not making them now. We actually we machined all of these. This is maybe my favorite EDC thing, and so it's not like I got into these utility blade knives and went out and bought everything and found the one I liked the best. I found the one that worked for me, where I sort of appreciated what was going on. It did help that we actually machined them, and that's good for me. I'm always looking for like the classic thing or something unique that, I mean, I guess really represents the personality of the designer. So other knives I've never been able to get a Grimsmo knife. The first fancy knife I ever bought was Chris Reeve tie lock with the mechanism designed by, the Hawks. I don't know if it was Gavin or Grant.
That was amazing designers.
Oh my God. Love their stuff. I bought a CRKT. It's funny. I'm not into knives, but I'm like excited to talk about them and tell you all the knives I have. I bought a CRKT grip lock, which is another Hawk design made in China. Amazing knife. Insane mechanism. I have 2 knives from Brad Southard. I mean, it's funny. I have like knives that I bought in like college and stuff that are just horrible, but I'm a hoarder, so I still have them. Oh, I've got a Quaken made in China one.
Okay.
From Burnley.
I like those a lot.
Yeah, it was just like, it's just a little bit different. And I mean, the thing I carry the most is either the Cub or, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. I can't remember the model of Brad's knife right now.
Ollie?
Nope.
The Tolk?
Yes. So I've got a Tolk and a Tolk Mini. The Tolk, it's funny. I got that at a show, I think, when my son was very young, where I was like still cutting food in a restaurant kind of thing. And that knife was big enough that I would like, and I mean, I live in the Bay Area, that I would like check over both shoulders before whipping it out and like cutting up a hot dog. So I ended up getting the Mini, which I love a lot. And I mean, I'm not into big knives. I'm not really into like, I don't know. I want it to be usable. That's really the main thing for me.
Yeah, I totally understand. All the EDC stuff that I carry has a very specific purpose, and it's not, I don't need something flashy. I need something that I can use for 5 or 10 years and feel good about my purchase the entire time.
Yeah, it works well, doesn't get in the way. It's there when you need it. So, I mean, honestly, flashlights, I pretty much carry a Delta all the time. Sometimes I will carry a Quark, which I tend to configure strangely. One of the things I'm trying to do with 4.7s is make them more customizable so you can use them how you want to do it. So like the Quark has an aspheric lens kit, which kind of turns it into a spotlight. That comes with a white reflector, but you can also just install the white reflector with a normal lens, and then you get a Mule, which is just a broad flood with no hot spot at all. So I tend to configure them that way because I have like a light that makes normal flashlight light. Sometimes I like to play around with other stuff, or like if I'm going to go camping, sometimes I'll take the aspheric because I know I'm going to be wanting to be looking further away.
What makes it an Alpha into a Delta? Or what is the difference between the Alpha and the Delta? So we can talk about the Delta at all.
Right. So, I mean, basically the Delta is our newest in-house Prometheus. Everyone had been making 18350 lights for years already. I mean, that was one of the, there's the 123 lights. When the 18350 was invented, everyone started doing that now. So it's like, I don't need to do that. But finally, I realized I had a specific perspective I wanted to apply to that. And I was like, okay, I will take a crack at it. I think it ended up being a fantastic light. An Alpha is a big light. We do make an Alpha Shorty, or you can buy a short tube so you can use a half size battery. But the Alpha was designed to last forever and take absolutely anything that you can throw at it. It is most definitely a tool. I mean, you can hammer nails with it. Like, I don't know, whatever dumb test people do with flashlights. I've done plenty of them. You can do with that. It'll survive it. The Delta is intended to be a dedicated EDC light, so you cannot hammer nails with it. But one of my big things is thermal management. And I think oftentimes people, I don't know, again, I like things to be done properly. Yes, you can put 1,000 horsepower engine into something that you're not supposed to put it into. But so in a flashlight, I am always concerned with the thermal performance and the ability to get heat out of the LEDs, because it takes actually very little power to generate a lot of heat. And so if the more power you have, the bigger light you need to move that heat away from the LEDs. So it maintains its actual output, and so that you don't shorten the life of the product. So one of the main things about the Delta is the exposed heat sink. So the entire pill of the light, and for those of you listening, that's just part of the assembly where on one end you install the LEDs and on the other end you install the electronics. So that entire thing is made out of solid copper. It's got some fins on it that's actually exposed to the environment and not pushed down inside of the head. One of the things with titanium is it's not very good at conducting heat. So this was basically my way of getting a titanium light that still has fantastic thermal performance, because we're, efficiently moving that heat out of the LEDs and the driver and into the environment.
Yeah, that's super cool. It's like a radiator, going back to car metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. That's a radiator. Thank you. Thank you for saying that in one word. The other thing with the Delta is it's a little bit longer than other flashlights, but I think for flashlights, there's also right sizing, and you can make the light too small to where you can't operate it comfortably. So for me, the Delta is exactly the same width as my fist side to side. That way I can still access the button, and my hand, it doesn't cover the light that's coming out, because what's the point in that? Like, why are you making the light if your hand is going to cover it? So it's a little bigger than some other 18350 lights, but again, that is completely intentional for a better ergonomic fit and user experience.
Yeah, that's super cool. I really like that. The last question we had was from Josh Hacko, and he asked, what products in the EDC market are you excited about, or what have you seen that excites you?
The Josh Hacko?
That is the Josh Hacko.
Well, actually, Hacko watches are my favorite EDC item I'm excited about right now.
Yeah, his new watch is so lust-worthy. I would love one.
Wait, and there are two of them, right?
Yeah.
Hackos? Brothers?
Father and son.
Oh, father and son. Okay, so I'm obviously not incredibly familiar with them, but I started following them a while ago. I think maybe when they got their Kern. What a cool idea. I sort of want to be doing that in some ways. Just building a watch company from the ground up and making all of the parts that go into it. That sounds both, equal parts amazing and equal parts I don't want to have anything to do with it, just because that is not easy, like we have discussed.
Yeah.
That's a lot of different types of manufacturing and machining to put together into something that where if you do the tiniest thing wrong, nothing works. It's crazy.
When you talk about picky customers, I know I talked a lot to Brad about that, but it seems like watch customers are even more to the nth degree of, let me break out my fiber 1,000 by microscope and look at the grain structure of this.
Yes, I listened to that episode and I was just gritting my teeth the entire time. Or that part of the conversation. What ED product has so? That was a cheap and easy answer to plug the owner of the question. I think it's super cool and I love seeing what they're doing. I don't get excited about EDC stuff unless it is special. And actually, it's funny. Again, I feel like the entire last year has vanished. So Zero Feud, mixed spinners, and also lanyard beads. I've actually been buying a bunch of his Lego Brickman heads. And again, I don't buy a lot of stuff, but I was like, that is cool. I wish I had that idea. So I'm just going to buy a bunch of them.
Yeah, I thought those were really a cool take on the whole lanyard bead thing.
Yeah, that was great. Every once in a while I see something where I'm just kicking myself, where I'm like, why did I not come up with that? But So yeah, you should go check those out. I mean, I bought a bunch of he did some with masks on, like Brickman heads with masks. And I think at Christmas, I bought everybody in the shop one of those beads, just kind of as a little pandemic joke.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Marks the year that it all came from, for sure.
yeah.
So before we get into shop news and new things, one thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I've had a lot of varying opinions on the podcast about Kickstarter, and you have had very successful Kickstarters. So I wanted to talk to you kind of your experience, whether you would continue to do them in the future, everything under the sun Kickstarter.
Oh, Kickstarter. That's just another place that is incredibly saturated. I think there's still room. I mean, you might as well do it. Like, why not? So for me, Kickstarter is about three things. Let's see if I can remember them all. It's about marketing in terms of building audience. It is about market validation. Do people like the thing that you're doing or the product? Third, it is sort of about funding. I mean, our earlier Kickstarter projects were definitely about funding. Like, I bought a lathe with the money from the pen Kickstarter. When I went to machining school, we had like a fraction of a semester on turning. So like when I got that machine in, I had never really operated a lathe before. And one of the cool thing about Haas is their controls are the same, and they've been the same for like decades, except for recently when they've kind of screwed them up. But like, I'm like, I can do this. I know where all the buttons are. How hard could it be? I mean, rather than like learning a completely new control on a process that I wasn't familiar with. Now they're more about marketing. We've slowed down a fair amount. Part of that is running a Kickstarter project is a full-time job. So now that I have 2 full-time jobs, I have a hard time adding a third one onto that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic platform. It has launched a lot of companies and products now. I mean, why not do it if you can do it?
So what products of yours were Kickstarted? You said your pens.
Oh my gosh.
I think your tops were as well, right?
Pens, beta flashlights, spin tops. We did this like little titanium key-shaped box opener thing called the EKO. We launched the Quark on Kickstarter. Oh, we did Kappa keychains. Then that it's funny with the Kappas, like I'd already been making the keychains for a couple of years, but only in brass. And that was, I think, kind of a blended goal where I was like, I could just make more, but the product's been popular. I could just get a leg up by putting this up on Kickstarter and doing 4 materials. And, that wasn't a huge project. It wasn't even a very big project, but it was like, in terms of running a business, that was like a nice little boost to capital and our ability to both generate some revenue and also expand the product line without a lot of risk on our end. Now, man, partly the production quality is so high on like a good Kickstarter videos now. Like that's pretty hard to meet. And even when I started, I had a buddy who was a filmmaker that, made our first Kickstarter videos. And I think at the time, like the standard was not so high. So those videos were a little more impressive, but holy cow, everybody's got their Peter McKinnon on these days. And I'm like, it just makes it so much more work to do a killer video instead of like just a really good one.
Yeah. I think that the capital investment into a Kickstarter is much higher nowadays than it was.
Yeah. And I mean, you don't have to have a McKinnon quality video.
It helps though.
It certainly doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
It like feels good if that's part of your thing also. I mean, I think on the EKO box opener project, like I just shot everything like as I was working, and it was more of like a work in process video with a quick open and close. And I just never felt good about it. I was like, I want to be better. I want to do more than that. And I mean, part of that is like, I am not here. Did I already say this? It'd be stupid if I repeated myself, but like, I'm not interested in doing a good job. Oh, I did say this already. It bears repeating. Like, I want everything to be good. It is hard to put out something where I'm like, that's not my best work. You're probably still better off doing it. Doing something less than optimally, I think, is better than just never doing it. Mm-hmm. So if that's the option, just bite the bullet and go with whatever you've got. I think as I've gotten busier as a business owner as well, This probably is going to sound bad, but like you learn where to make compromises. Making no compromises is a luxury of someone who is less busy than they will be later. And they just don't, maybe they don't know it yet.
Well, and another 80-20 rule from Jocko Willink is, if your subordinates or somebody you hire, or even yourself, if you can get it 80% of the way there, it's good enough and you should just execute on it. Like you can get the other 20% later if you still need it. But that's the time to pull the trigger and just get it done.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, again, in terms of talking about Kickstarter, like have a longer term plan. Like if you don't think you can accomplish your goal on that first round, like set it up into 2 or 3 pieces and figure out what is going to be good enough for that first step. I mean, there's also, what's the saying? Like perfect is the enemy of good.
Something like that.
That's not quite right, but that's the general idea. Yeah, you can work on something forever and just never do anything with it. So you have to decide when you're ready to go and if that's going to be good enough. And even a lot of Kickstarters, they come back for like version 2 of the thing, right? And you've already built that audience. You've already captured some market. I think a lot of the times maybe that's actually a good strategy. I mean, I wouldn't choose to do it artificially where you're like, oh, we're going to hold back this feature because we're going to get them the second time around. If you're an individual or a small entrepreneur, like just figure out what you need to get over the first finish line, because that first finish line is not the finish line.
Right. Definitely. Well, that brings us to shop news, new things. What is going on in your shop? New machines or wrapping back up production after an insane year, not being able to get anything?
Oh, shop news. We're having some turnover. Han, who does our finishing and assembly, is leaving to pursue other things. So we're hiring. If anybody wants a job, it's up on our website. I don't know. We're out of space, which is a constant problem. I can't afford to move anywhere else because our rent is substantially below market because we've been in our space for so long. We bought an SC20 last year. It was maybe like about a year ago.
That was my first introduction to your podcast, was your whole $100,000 mistake episode.
Yeah, so I bought the wrong machine. So that was fun.
Yeah, so if anybody hasn't heard it, definitely go check it out. I'm no expert. I'm no expert with you and Ben.
Yep.
And it's a great listen. And that episode, my heart went out to you. Listen, I was like, I can only imagine. Like,
yeah, I mean, we've mostly worked it out, but at the time, that was the largest financial mistake. Like literally mistake, not just like didn't see it coming or poor judgment or something. I just screwed up. So yeah, that's a fun lesson.
There's
that machine's up and running. It's making great parts.
Good. But I listened to it and I mean, yeah, it's your machine. You ordered it, but like there's some culpability to your salesman as well that I just could not believe that you tell him like, oh, these are all the parts I'm making. And he wasn't like, you can't make those on this machine, buddy.
Yeah. I mean, and I emailed him and I was like, oh man, I assume there's nothing we can do. But he's like, yeah, I thought that was a little weird. And I was like, would have been worth mentioning a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely go check it out. I'll link the episode in the show notes because
cool.
Yeah, it was the first time I listened to your podcast. I can't remember. It was maybe on Instagram. Somebody had mentioned it or Discord or something. And I was like, what? I got to listen. That sounds crazy. There's no way that it happened. Like,
yeah, it was both good clickbait actually happened. And I think that was one of the most popular episodes we've ever done. People like to watch a train wreck, right?
Unfortunately, that is the truth.
Well, it's all good content.
Yeah.
Other shop news. So I'm buying a Form 3. I am also buying a Fuse 1.
Oh, congrats.
What? I've never used, I don't know. I hope this works out well for me. I've been doing a ton of research over the last few months. I've talked to Forum Labs a lot. I'm not sure I should say this out loud, but I badgered them into actually printing our parts as samples.
Good. As it should be. It drives me nuts that they're here's a rook. This represents everything you're going to do, right?
Yeah, actually, partly I understand they don't want to be printing parts for tire kickers, but I felt like this conversation had gone on long enough. And they're like, sorry, we can only print like however many parts for you. And I'm like, well, then I'm not buying a machine.
Right.
And they were like, actually, we could print the parts for you.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
It's not a cheap printer either. Like,
it's worth their investment. I will say, so I was one of the original Kickstarter backers for the Form 1.
Oh, wow.
And I made almost enough money to cover my Kickstarter investment by doing test prints for people on the Formlab forums.
Oh.
Because at that time, all they were sending out was just that Rook. And even that was taking 6 months to get to people. So I had people literally all around the world send me files. I had like a toy maker in Germany. I had somebody working on like the Advanced Warrior project in India, send me all this stuff. So it's interesting that they still don't do that, as big as they've got.
Yeah, I mean, so for the Fuse in particular, I didn't request samples for the forum, but there's like this little box, print and place box that you can get.
I ordered one. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Did you get it?
Yeah.
It's funny because it's like, do you want this? Yes. Do you really, really want it? Yes. Like, are you positive you're not wasting our time? Yes. And then they'll like send you one, which again, I sort of get. But like that, I mean, when you can start doing that kind of stuff in metal, that's going to be crazy. I mean, I feel like I'm partly the reason I'm getting that printer is for a plastic technology in terms of the material properties, ease of use, not having to use supports. Like this is kind of what I've been waiting for, in terms of maturity.
So what swayed you to that over another Markforged? Because you use that to print your Tasklight, right?
Yes. So the Markforged is an amazing piece of hardware. I would recommend it unequivocally. It just prints every time. Like I'm 100% confident when I print that print button, and when I come back, my part's going to be finished and correct, which I've had some, mostly like sort of hobby grade printers that I even like spent years modifying, and like it's always such a headache, and I spend more time fixing the printer than printing parts. So the Markforged is an FDM printer, which does come with some of the limitations like support material and having to design around part orientation and that sort of thing. I bought the version, and I got it used, fortunately, or I'd be more upset about it. I bought the version that you can print Kevlar and carbon fiber filament into the part. I've actually never used it. I mean, the material was generally quite strong. So I've been like, I just need to design something that forces me to use that, because this is a complete waste. So let me know if you come up with anything. I've been racking my brain.
The only thing I've seen that like really needs that was like aero bits for cars, things with like deflectional forces.
Right. Yeah.
And like I know that the sample little keychains they send you, one in just nylon and one that's fiber
It's crazy.
It's insane.
Yeah.
I still don't think, I've never like put it in a vise and hit with a hammer, but like
but just
by
like
hand, I don't think I could ever break that.
No, there's no way. So I mean that's partly what sold me, and I was like, oh, that's so cool that you can do that. I just haven't found the need for it. Partly because the base material is already so good. I don't know, maybe if you printed like vice jaws, you would want to print the filament into it. I haven't really tried that. But yeah, so right now the plan is to transition most of the stuff we make on the Markforged into the Fuse, and I can also potentially like ornament it a little more and make it more cool. The Markforged stuff is very utilitarian, kind of like manual machining. Like there's just, unless you're gonna like get in there with like files and stuff like that, in terms of just normal machining, you've got 3 axes or whatever, and that's kind of what you get.
Right.
So the other thing is the 4/7 headlamp that we make. Product plug. Is that allowed on this podcast?
Of course. You're taking time to come on here. I'm happy to plug all your stuff. And so that's for the MK3, I think, or something?
Yeah. So there's the Mini and the Mini Turbo light. We make a headlamp where the flashlight can snap into the headlamp. And 4/7's had this before, but the thing I changed was actually put Velcro hook on the back of the headlamp, and then it ships with a couple of loop patches. So you can stick that loop to whatever you want and mount the headlamp to it. We also have a hat with like a flag patch on the front. You can put the headlamp on the front of the hat, which I think is super cool.
It's pretty neat. Yeah.
That's one of those things where I'm like, the headlamp itself, I would admit, looks kind of dumb because it just like sticks out of your forehead like a unicorn, but it works really well. It works even better with the hat. But the big thing that I didn't like is you have to take the pocket clip off of the flashlight in order to put it into the headlamp, which, depending on how you use that system, maybe that's a problem for you, maybe it's not. So I just wanted to make a revision to the headlamp that has a notch cut out of 2 parts. So it just allows you to keep the pocket clip on the light and put it in the headlamp. The problem is the headlamp is currently made from 5 separate injection molded parts.
Oh, goodness. Wow.
And which is insane. I mean, so to redo any single mold on that is probably going to cost us $10,000 or $15,000. So just to do those 2 parts, I was going to be at, $20,000 to $30,000 just in tooling costs. And I'm like, I think I can just print these. Like, I don't need to injection mold them. I wish we were selling like 10,000 a year. So go to the website and buy one. But I'm like, look, we don't need to redo the molds. I'm just going to print the entire headlamp just in time as needed, assemble to order, and we can customize and change like anything we want every round of printing. So that was my excuse. I'm just really kind of a technology nerd. So
believe me, if I could make even half a business case for a Fuse One, I would be, getting one shipped to my shop. So I understand.
Let me know if you want some parts.
Yeah, definitely. I was much more impressed with that test little box than I thought I would be, especially with the threads and the little walls down to, I forget what the smallest thickness was, but and it's very strong.
I was actually surprised. So one of my big worries, because the failure mode for nylon 12 is to shatter, as far as I know, that the parts were just going to be too weak and too brittle. But like all the test parts we got, I did not intentionally destroy them, which I may end up doing, but I abused them to the extent I thought would be unreasonable during normal use. And it was like, I got no problem with this. So that was pretty interesting. They also make the nylon 11, which might be more suitable for other applications, but I think the powder changeover process takes like half a day or something. So I'm like, I do not want to even attempt to be going back and forth. But.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to see your experience too with using the powder recovery and all of that, because it's only 50% you can use used nylon or something?
Technically with the 12, it's 30.
Okay.
So that's 70% used.
Oh, okay.
It's a 30% refresh.
I don't understand that, I guess. How did they
why?
Yeah, like why can't I use 100% reclaimed powder?
So my understanding is the build chamber gets heated up to I forget the engineering term, just below the melting point of the
glass temperature. Is that it?
Yeah, like the glass transition temperature or something.
Yeah.
So the Fuse uses a fairly low energy laser. So it needs to have the energy already in the powder for that laser to actually solidify it. That does cause some clumping of the base powder.
Okay.
So I think my understanding, it was effectively degrade your resolution and service quality.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes total sense. I appreciate that.
But I'm not sure. Because I'm not sure I'm going to be happy with a 70% used, 30% fresh quality. So that'll be one of the first, and I don't know. It's like dumb to spend this much money and not be sure, but that'll be one of the first things I probably test is like where the limits are in terms of the refresh rate. Like 50/50 is supposed to be pretty good, which is relatively typical. It is very hard to pack a build chamber with 50% density.
I can see that. Yeah.
So, I'm also just trying not to waste material because I'm a machinist and a natural miser. And waste is the enemy.
Well, that's really cool. I look forward to seeing you getting it and hearing your opinion of it, because it's definitely cool. Cool tech.
Yeah, cautiously optimistic. But at least I'm pretty sure I ordered the right machine. So that's a good starting place.
Yeah. Especially, there is nothing else in that price point, I think, that comes anywhere near what it can do. So
yeah, I forget the other one that I looked at. I didn't go as far as getting a quote on it, but I don't know. Formlabs has their act together as a brand. I'm like relatively confident in them, even though I don't actually own any of their products yet. So good job on the branding, Formlabs.
Well, like I said, I had a Form 1, which I can kind of liken to some of those hobby FDM printers. Like I was getting maybe 60% success rate with that. The Form 2 that I have at my day job, I have had literally 100% success rate over 10 liters or something like that. Like I've done a lot of printing. The only failure I've ever had is because I let my resin tank get too low and there was no resin left in the thing. And so it just printed nothing. It wasn't even a failure. It was just nothing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and that's what it's supposed to do, right? Like in terms of, I mean, I think what the expectation is, I mean, partly in terms of like the Buck Rogers future, like a lot of things we use don't really work well, partly because the technology is not mature and somebody's got to go first. So thank you for building the future.
Yeah. Well, I would liken them to kind of the Apple of SL printers. Like I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, I can buy any cubic for so much less. And it's like, yeah, you can use all the resins and it's open source, but like, yes, Formlabs wants you to use their resin. It's very expensive, yada, yada, yada. You got to replace their tanks with their tanks.
Yeah.
But it'll work every time. And it's designed to work every time. And so.
And I think even if you're like a serious hobbyist or, particularly in a professional setting, like I don't want to come back. I mean, like on the Markforged, when I print 2 task lights, it takes 33 hours.
Right.
I don't want to come back and find a failed print after, expending that much material and time. So yeah, I mean, for 3D printing in particular, like for it to just work every time is, I think, a huge technical accomplishment. It's also exactly what I want.
Yeah, it's worth the extra money for sure.
Yeah.
So I round out every episode by asking my guest, what have you been researching this week? It can be machining related. It could be food. We've got people that have talked about their new babies. What's been popping up in Google or whatever search engine you use a lot.
Oh, I actually prepared for this one. And I think we actually have talked about a lot of it already. So I've been deeply obsessed with the Formlabs website in recent months and weeks. Also, so we're trying to hire somebody right now. I was like, I've always just found people accidentally word of mouth kind of thing. And I was like, this time, I don't know. I don't have any options. So I was like, I don't know, Grimsmo post stuff on social. I'm going to try that. We didn't get any hits.
Oh, I'm surprised.
I mean, like they have to be local and stuff. So my expectations weren't super high.
You don't just go hang out in the bar next door and help you find somebody?
Not anymore. And then, we sent out the newsletter. I'm like, again, that doesn't really make sense because those are people everywhere. But, part of it's like, hey, we're hiring. That's cool. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to use one of those tools. So I'm like, what ad have I heard a lot on my podcast? Oh, ZipRecruiter. So I actually literally signed up for that last night, posted the job, and like I already have a couple results back. I don't know.
Wow.
Well, I mean, their whole thing is like 80% of companies get a qualified candidate within, the first 24 hours. It doesn't mean that you hired them. It just means like they might fit the job. So I don't know. We'll see how this goes. It seems super weird. This is like as close as I've come to online dating. So we'll see how that plays out.
So jumping back real quick to the Formlabs stuff, why both printers versus just the Fuse?
So the Fuse one for volume, part size, and material properties. So again, I've actually got a new task light coming out that is a much smaller head, which I'm pretty excited about. So we'll be printing a couple of task lights, flashlight boxes. We make some like flashlight tools, and I don't know, I'd work on some other stuff that I haven't posted yet, but I'm like, what can actually manufacture with 3D printing? Because it's kind of cool. So I can talk about this. Grimsmo's, it's a air cylinder part ejector. Was that Grimsmo?
Yeah, I think so.
5C ejector. So I was like, oh, that's a good idea. So I basically made my own. And so the ones we're using now are actually 3D printed on the Markforged, but that material is hydroscopic, right? It absorbs water.
Yeah.
So it eventually
nylon is crazy for that.
It eventually gets weird, but nylon 12 has like a 0.05% like water absorption, which is like basically doesn't absorb water. So I'm curious to try that out. I mean, coolant will destroy absolutely anything that I've been able to put into it. So I don't know if it'll stand up to that, but I'm curious.
So you bought it more as like a production machine, whereas the Form 3 will be a prototype machine.
And so for task lights, for the same 30-some hour build time, I can get 6 out of the Fuse, and I can only get 2 off of the Markforged.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So yeah, that'll be more, ideally, I'm like talking myself into this. Yeah, more production oriented. And the form, I just want to start printing some smaller components that either we have not made or that we have machined or have had injection molded. But again, every time you want to change something, it's a huge hassle. But I just needed the higher resolution, basically.
Okay. Very cool. Well, yeah, definitely look forward to seeing what you have going on with both of those.
Well, and so one thing I was like, can we 3D print all of our silicone, like rubber buttons and stuff?
Oh.
And like, we could do it, but I think you can have any color you want as long as it's clear.
Right.
And they're like, you can dye it, but it probably won't work well. And I'm like, I'm not sure where the cool line meets the practical line.
Yeah. But you can at least prototype new versions of a clicky button, which is helpful.
We could. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know. I like the idea of making absolutely everything ourselves, like some of those other kids do. But I mean, right now, some of those things are just not practical. So partly I'm interested in like what 3D printing can help us do more of in-house and also just allow us to iterate a lot faster.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, we bought the one at my day job specifically for CMM fixtures. And so for fixtures where you don't have a lot of forks, assembly fixtures too, it's worked amazingly. Like it's super nice to just like design it, print it overnight. I come in the next day and I can use it. So
how do you find the overall accuracy of
it's good.
The SLA parts?
It's for sure plus or minus 5, if not better, every time. There is a little bit of shrink.
Is it consistent?
It's consistent. There is different shrinkage in Z versus X and Y.
Right.
Because the Z is compression shrinkage, whereas the X and Y is just cure. And then there's definitely shrinkage from when it comes out of the printer to after the alcohol bath and the curing station.
Right. So presumably all that is generally accounted for in however the build is processed.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I'm really worried about like super tight tolerance, like if I have a pin fit that I need for the fixture, I'll just design a rough hole and then I'll go and ream it on a manual or I'll end mill it to size where it needs to be exact. So yeah, it's been fantastic. I can't say enough good things about it.
All right. Yeah, that's good. I mean, that one was a little bit more of a wild card for me, but like right now there's one specific part I want and I'm like, I just need to print it. So yeah, I mean, with the Markforged, I mean, it's an FDM printer. I would say plus or minus 3 thou is like the outside of the tolerance. Like sometimes it's better that depending on the feature shape and size.
Wow.
It's crazy.
That's really good.
I mean, yeah. So like I print a lot of fixtures for the laser on that. And it's the same thing. I mean, the hole's always, it's never a pin fit. So I just go in with the reamer and hit that and boom, it just drops right on. I'm like, not going to machine that. Get out of here.
Right. Yeah.
It'll take me a week to figure out.
Well, and like the people at my work were constantly like, oh, that takes 10 hours. Like, that's terrible. That's so long. I can make it faster. I'm like, I made it overnight. You were sleeping. What are you talking about? Like,
yeah.
Oh boy.
Could use those sleeping hours more.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, go ahead and plug all your socials, plug all your companies, where they can find you, your podcast. Please use the platform.
I'm trying to remember that whole list right now. All my socials. First of all, Jason Huey with Prometheus Lights and 4.7s. You can find both of those brands through darksucks.com. Or if you find that distasteful, you can also type in prometheuslights.com, but it's going to take you to the same place. We are on Instagram and Facebook under, I believe, Prometheus Lights and 4.7s. We actually also have a Dark Sucks Facebook group if you're into that kind of thing. What was the last one?
Podcast. Where can they find you there?
You can also listen to Ben and I banter on about everything and nothing on the I'm No Expert podcast, available on iTunes and wherever you get your podcasts.
I just listened to your one on titanium yesterday, so it was
good.
Yeah, it was a good one. Before we wrap up, real quick, Patreon thank yous. Thank you to Aussie Machinist 7. Thanks for joining the Patreon. Thanks for everyone who pledges. It's great. Lets me send mics to people who need them. Cover all the overhead costs, and I really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Jason, for joining me and, just nerding out with me about all things lights and 3D printing and all the good stuff. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I am always down for a good nerd out. So thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I was pretty excited. I was like, oh my gosh, this is my first guest appearance. So thank you to you. Also, thank you to all of your listeners for tuning in. And I hope you check us out as well.
Yeah, go buy some lights, guys. Thank you. Thanks for everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week.